In the autumn of 1893, the village of Oymyakon, Siberia, was preparing for its annual ritual, the negotiation with death. In this corner of the world, winter isn't a season, it's an apex predator. Here, at the pole of cold, the mercury doesn't just drop, it retreats into hiding. At -60 degrees, steel shatters like glass, and a single breath can turn your lungs into a graveyard of ice crystals. Every man in the village followed the law of the ancestors. Build thick, build heavy, pack the gaps with moss and mud until the walls are as dense as the earth itself. Then, pray you have enough wood to keep the fire screaming until April. But this year there was a ghost in the village. Nikolai Sokolov, a 20-year-old exile with the tired eyes of a man who had seen too much of the Tsar's prisons, was doing something that made the elders cross themselves in fear. He wasn't building a fortress of logs, he was building a skeleton. Look at the student. Ivan, the village's master carpenter, would shout to the tavern crowds, his voice thick with the smell of cheap vodka and derision. He's building a hat for his house. He thinks he can outsmart the Siberian frost with a few scrap planks and a handful of Swiss drawings. He's gift-wrapping his own coffin. Ivan had built 52 cabins in his life. He knew the truth of the North. To stay warm, you need mass, you need wood, you need the brute force of a roaring hearth. Nikolai, however, was obsessed with a different truth, the invisible architecture of stillness. While the villagers spent their days felling the oldest, thickest spruce trees, Nikolai was using a silver micrometer to measure a void. He was erecting a secondary roof and a second set of walls, positioned exactly 14 inches away from his primary structure. To the untrained eye, it was wasteful madness. It was a birdcage that added no strength to the house, yet consumed twice the labor. Why the gap? Nikolai, a curious child, once asked. Nikolai didn't look up from his calculations. Because a wall of wood eventually gets cold, he whispered, but a wall of still air. Still air is a wall that the frost cannot climb. The community dismissed him as a broken man, an orphan of the university who had lost his mind in the frozen taiga. They called his construction the Sokolov Folly. They predicted that when the first true blizzard arrived, the weight of the snow on that double roof would crush him in his sleep, his scientific theories buried under a mountain of white. But as the Siberian sun began to set for the final time in November, a strange pressure began to drop in the atmosphere. The animals went silent. The sky turned a bruised, metallic purple. The great death was coming. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the traditional strength of Siberia was about to be put on trial by a boy who believed in the power of a vacuum. Nikolai Sokolov did not rely on the superstitions of the taiga. He relied on a tattered leather-bound journal he had smuggled out of the St. Petersburg Imperial Technological Institute. Inside were the forbidden observations of alpine architects, men who had spent centuries studying how heat behaves when it is cornered, while his neighbors believed that the only way to stop the cold was to block it with mass. Nikolai understood a more elegant truth. The cold is not a thing that moves in, but an absence of heat that moves out. To the villagers, his birdcage was a structural disaster waiting to happen. They saw the 14-inch gap between his inner log walls and his outer cedar shell as a waste of habitable space. But in Nikolai's mind, that gap was the most important room in the house. He was creating a pressure localized before a reservoir of air that sat at a neutral pressure. He knew that the standard Siberian cabin was a victim of the stack effect. When a fire is lit inside a traditional home, the warm air becomes less dense and rises, escaping through the roof and pulling frigid high-pressure air through every microscopic crack in the logs. The harder his neighbors stoked their fires, the faster they turned their homes into vacuums that sucked the killing frost inside. Nikolai's secondary shell broke this cycle. When his cabin breathed, it didn't inhale the razor-sharp wind of the tundra. It inhaled the pre-warmed still air from the corridor. He was essentially wrapping his home in a thermos. Still air, he noted in his journal, is the best insulator ever created by God. 14 inches of trapped air holds warmth better than 14 inches of solid wood because air molecules are too far apart to conduct heat effectively. Then there was the matter of infrared radiation. Nikolai had lined the inner surface of his outer shell with thin reflective plates of scrap iron, while iron is a conductor of cold. Its surface acts as a mirror for heat waves. As the warmth from his inner logs tried to escape into the night, It struck the iron and was bounced back toward the house. He wasn't just burning wood. He was recycling every vibration of energy his hearth produced. By mid-December, the Sokolov Folly had become a laboratory of impossible results. While the village master, Ivan, was burning through 9 cords of wood just to keep his floor from freezing, Nikolai was sitting in his shirt sleeves, reading by a fire that barely flickered. His firewood had reached a state of blue flame perfection because he had stacked it within the dry, circulating air of the birdcage corridor. The moisture content had plummeted to 10%, making it burn with the ferocity of a torch. As the mercury continued to retreat and the great Appalachian-style pressure drop began to settle over Oymyakon, the laughter in the tavern died away. The villagers noticed that Nikolai's windows never fogged and his roof never groaned. But the true test was only hours away. The sky had turned the color of a bruised plum, and the wind began to build a steady low-frequency howl that vibrated in the very marrow of their bones. The great death was no longer a prediction. It was at the door. Nikolai checked the 47 vertical support posts of his secondary roof one last time, knowing that his life depended on the mathematics of a dead grandfather and the stillness of a 14-inch void. If you're fascinated by how forgotten science can outsmart nature's deadliest forces, make sure to subscribe. We have more documented accounts of survival that history tried to forget. The blizzard did not arrive as a mere storm, it arrived as a cold-blooded executioner. On the night of February 3rd, the temperature in Oymyakon plummeted to a depth that defied human memory, falling to a staggering -65 degrees Celsius. The wind, a 90-mile-per-hour wall of horizontal white, turned the village into a featureless void where direction and distance ceased to exist. This was the Great White Silence, a high-pressure system so dense it felt as though the atmosphere itself was trying to crush the life out of every living lung. Inside the traditional cabins, the experience was a slow descent into sensory horror. Ivan, the master carpenter, stood by his hearth, his face scorched red by a roaring fire, while his back felt the phantom touch of 1,000 freezing needles. The air was thick with the most terrifying sound known to the north, the screaming of the timber. As the sub-zero air outside clashed with the extreme heat of the fire, the massive spruce logs began to groan and snap. Every few minutes, a crack like a rifle shot echoed through the room, a sound caused by wood fibers literally exploding as internal moisture turned to ice and expanded with irresistible force. The frost was no longer an external threat. It was a living entity, an uninvited guest. White, crystalline mold began crawling up the interior walls, sealing door latches and window locks with a grip of iron. Families huddled under layers of bison robes, watching in despair as the mud chinking between their logs, shaken loose by the violent vibrations of the gale, fell away in frozen clumps. Through these microscopic gaps, the Arctic wind hissed like a serpent, stripping all moisture from the air and making every breath feel like inhaling shards of broken glass. By the 4th day, the structural limits of the old world were reached. Standard cabin roofs began to fail under snow loads they were never designed to bear. Ivan's roof, the pride of his 40-year career, groaned under a weight exceeding 55 pounds per square foot. At nearly 4 in the morning, the center beam cracked with a deafening boom. He barely evacuated his family into the snow before the entire structure collapsed inward, burying their winter food supply and leaving them homeless in a frozen tomb. But less than a verst away, Nikolai Sokolov sat in a world that seemed to belong to another planet. While the village was a scream of breaking wood and freezing lungs, Nikolai's home was a whisper of absolute stillness. Inside the birdcage, the physics of the static buffer were performing a miracle. The outer shell of cedar and iron took the entire kinetic assault of the storm. The 80-mile-per-hour gusts shattered against the iron skin. Their energy dissipated long before they could touch the inner sanctuary, while his neighbors fought a high-pressure vacuum that sucked the warmth from their very bones. Nikolai sat in a pressure-neutral zone. The air in his corridor remained as still as a tomb, pre-warmed by the cabin's own thermal bleed to a constant, survivable temperature. His candles did not flicker. His water bucket did not skin over with ice. He was a man who had built a case strong enough to protect the delicate movement of life. The final proof of his wasteful madness came when a heavy, dull strike thudded against his outer door. Nikolai stepped into the corridor, unbolted the shell, and found Ivan, the man who had mocked him most, collapsed across the threshold, a jagged sculpture of ice. Ivan's breath was a ragged gasp, the sound of a man whose lungs were failing. In his arms, he carried his youngest child, whose skin was the color of a winter moon. "The wind is a thief, Ivan," Nikolai said softly as he pulled them into the 72-degree heat of his inner room. "You tried to lock the door, but you left the windows open to the sky. You don't fight a thief with a bigger fire. You fight him by giving him nothing to grab." The sun vanished behind a leaden horizon, not to be seen again for weeks. In Oymyakon they don't measure winter by the calendar, but by the weight of the silence. That night, however, the silence was replaced by a sound that felt like the earth itself was being torn asunder. The great death had arrived. It wasn't just a blizzard, it was a localized apocalypse. The temperature plummeted to a bone-snapping -65°C. At this depth of cold, the physical world begins to behave differently. Steel becomes as brittle as dry clay, and the very air feels heavy, thick with the lethality of the Arctic. The wind didn't just blow, it hunted. With gusts exceeding 90 miles per hour, the horizontal snow became a sandpaper of ice, scouring the village and ripping the traditional shingle roofs from their rafters as if they were made of paper. This was the moment of reckoning for the ancestral wisdom of the village. In the center of the settlement, the cabin of Ivan the master carpenter became a theater of tragedy. For 40 years, Ivan had been the authority on survival, but his pride was now being crushed under the literal weight of the sky. His roof, built with the thickest timber available, began to groan. It was a low guttural sound, the protest of wood fibers being pushed beyond their breaking point. Under the relentless accumulation of snow over 70 pounds per square foot, Ivan's home transformed into a trap. The single-layer construction meant that the heat from his massive fire was radiating upward, melting the bottom layer of snow just enough to turn it into a heavy, suffocating sheet of ice. This ice didn't slide. It anchored itself, inviting more snow to pile higher and higher. At 3 a.m., the center ridge beam, a trunk of seasoned spruce, it snapped with a sound that echoed like a cannon shot through the howling gale. Ivan and his family were forced to watch as their ceiling sagged lower and lower, a slow-motion collapse that threatened to bury them in a tomb of timber and frost. But while the village was a symphony of destruction, Nikolai Sokolov's cabin stood in eerie, defiant stillness. To the neighbors who could still see through the blinding white, Nikolai's home looked like a miracle. But it wasn't a miracle. It was a masterpiece of physics. As the snow piled onto Nikolai's secondary roof, the second great surprise of his design was revealed. The villagers had mocked his steep and wasteful 42-degree pitch. They preferred the flatter, standard 32-degree roofs because they were easier to build. But in the Great Death, that 10-degree difference meant the difference between life and death. Nikolai had calculated the friction coefficient of frosted oak versus shifting snow. Because his outer roof was a cold roof, meaning no heat from the interior reached it to melt the snow into ice, the snow remained powdery and light. The moment it reached a critical mass, the 42-degree angle took over. Regular rhythmic avalanches, the snow would slide off the outer shell, thundering harmlessly to the ground. These avalanches began to form massive natural walls of snow around the base of Nikolai's cabin. To a casual observer, it looked like the house was being buried. In reality, Nikolai was letting the storm build him a secondary fortress. These snow walls acted as a tertiary layer of insulation, blocking the wind from hitting the lower walls and creating a pocket of absolute dead air around the foundation. Inside, Nikolai sat by a small, efficient fire. He could hear the storm, but he couldn't feel it. His internal ceiling remained warm and dry, untouched by the thousands of pounds of white death that were currently flattening the village. The birdcage was no longer a folly. It was the only sanctuary left in Oymyakon. The weight of the sky was falling on everyone. But Nikolai had figured out how to make the sky slide right off his shoulders. As he adjusted the silver micrometer on his desk, he knew the laughter in the tavern would never return. The elders had built with their hands, but Nikolai had built with the invisible laws of the universe. As the blizzard reached its zenith, the village of Oymyakon became a graveyard of failed engineering. But inside Nikolai's cabin, a silent, invisible miracle was unfolding, one governed not by luck, but by the relentless laws of thermodynamics. to understand why Nikolai remained in shirt sleeves while his neighbors froze. One must look at the thermal envelope he had constructed in a traditional Siberian cabin. The walls are a single point of failure. The massive spruce logs, though thick, are subject to thermal bridging. As the external temperature drops to -65, the cold eventually saturates the wood, turning the entire wall into a giant ice block that radiates freezing energy directly into the living space. Nikolai's birdcage eliminated this bridge. By creating a 14-inch void, he had decoupled his home from the environment. The secret lay in the stillness of the air. Nikolai knew that air is only a poor insulator when it is moving. By sealing the outer shell, he prevented the wind from stripping away the boundary layer of warmth clinging to his inner logs. This trapped air acted as a thermal shock absorber. While the outside world was a chaotic storm of kinetic energy, the air inside the gap sat at a neutral pressure. It was a pressure-equalized buffer that neutralized wind speeds of 90 miles per hour before they could even touch his primary structure. But the most profound discovery was the stack effect reversal. In Ivan's collapsing cabin, the roar of the fire was actually his enemy. The rising heat created a vacuum at the floor level, pulling the killing frost through the gaps in the timber. In Nikolai's home, the air in the 14-inch corridor was pre-warmed by the minor heat loss of the inner cabin. When Nikolai's stove needed oxygen, it didn't pull in -60-degree air. It pulled in temperate air from the birdcage. His home was breathing its own warmth. The sensory contrast was staggering. While the villagers huddled in cabins that smelled of damp soot and despair, Nikolai's air was dry and crisp. His firewood, stored in the circulating air of the corridor, had reached a state of kinetic seasoning, allowing it to burn with a clean blue flame that produced almost no smoke. The climax of this engineering triumph arrived on the 10th day. A series of heavy, frantic thuds echoed against the outer oak planks. Nikolai unbolted the secondary shell to find a scene of absolute devastation. Ivan, the man who had mocked the student more than any other, was kneeling in the snow, his beard a solid block of ice. Behind him, a line of 30 survivors, the remnants of 6 shattered households, clutched each other in a desperate rope line. Their Faugai had failed. Their tradition had crumbled. As they stumbled into the 72-degree sanctuary of the birdcage, they didn't find a fool's hat. They found a masterclass in precision. For the next 11 days, 27 people lived in a space meant for one. Yet, thanks to the thermal buffer, the temperature never dropped. The Sokolov Folly had become the only lifeboat in a sea of white death. The Great Death of 1894 eventually retreated, leaving Oymyakon transformed into a silent landscape of splintered spruce and collapsed dreams. But as the snow melted, the reputation of Nikolai Sokolov stood taller than any mountain in the taiga. The Sokolov Folly was no longer a joke. It was a blueprint for the future. The survivors who emerged from that 14-inch pocket of air carried the story of the birdcage across the Russian Empire. Within a decade, the double roof and double wall technique began to appear in every new construction across the Siberian frontier. Builders who once mocked the student now meticulously measured air gaps with the same surgical precision Nikolai had pioneered. They realized that in the battle against the Arctic, strength was a lie, but physics was an absolute truth. The economic impact was a quiet revolution. Families living in these breathing houses consumed nearly 50% less firewood than those in traditional cabins. This didn't just save labor. It saved the forests and allowed settlements to thrive in environments previously considered uninhabitable. Nikolai's work proved that 14 inches of still air was more valuable than a mountain of timber, but the ultimate vindication came nearly a century later. In 1978, modern building scientists at North Carolina State University reconstructed Nikolai's specific designs to understand their resilience under laboratory conditions. The results were staggering. Nikolai's double-shell system offered 2.4 times greater heating efficiency and a structural load capacity that exceeded traditional single-roof cabins by over 300%. His wasteful second roof was actually the most efficient piece of engineering in the history of the frontier. Today, Nikolai Sokolov's legacy is written into the skylines of our most advanced cities. The world's leading architects now utilize double-skin facades for high-performance skyscrapers. These buildings use a secondary glass envelope to create a thermal buffer zone, a 21st century version of the Siberian birdcage. It allows the structure to breathe, regulating temperature and pressure through the same invisible logic. Nikolai smuggled out of a St. Petersburg prison. We call it sustainable design and passive engineering, but at its heart, it is the same simple truth discovered by an orphan in the cold. It is the understanding that the most powerful shield we have is not the mass we build, but the stillness we capture. Nikolai Sokolov didn't just build a house, he built a philosophy of survival. He taught us that when the world is screaming at its loudest, the only way to survive is to create a space where the ear and the mind can remain perfectly, safely still. Nikolai's birdcage was just the beginning. If you want to see more deep dives into the engineering marvels of the past, hit the like button and join our community. What would you have built in Nikolai's shoes? Let us know in the comments.